Eagle to Can Crow come in. Eagle to Can Crow. What do you got in the tapestry family there? I got a question. Are elections in Guyana ever free and fair? Guyana's next presidential election is scheduled for September 1st, just shy of a month or so. And there are three factors that will play a decisive role in those elections. Hear me. 1, the population growth. 2, the number of immigrants now in Guyana, most of which are Venezuelans. And 3, the revised list of electors. Now, for all intents and purposes, Guyana Tapestry stays clear of politics and political commentary, because as we all know, these topics tend to be divisive and polarizing. The objective of this platform, Guyana Tapestry, is to unite the community, country, and diaspora. But the scramble for power in the lead up to the 2025 general and regional elections and the wild cards this election cycle, democracy itself is on the ballot. And democracy is about participation. It's about engagement. So to be complicit in silence while watching the country's future decided is not an option. This discussion is therefore an attempt to highlight some key historic facts and bring some perspective, if not to initiate, then to contribute to a conversation, a sensible conversation about the importance of free and fair elections as a cornerstone to strengthening democratic institutions and good governance in Guyana. Now, just earlier this year, the country celebrated 55 years as a republic, and in Guyana's case, a cooperative republic. Guyana is described by international political institutions as a parliamentary democracy with a lively press and a robust civil society. That gives us a little bit of a responsibility. But are we really? Elections are an essential mechanism for civic participation, and they allow citizens to hold their elected leaders, officials accountable. Elections are considered an institutional prerequisite for democracy. But far too often, elections in Guyana have served merely to perpetuate or legitimize the status quo. In theory, several characteristic features typify what political science calls a polyarchal democracy. According to political scholar Robert Dahl in his 1971 publication, Polyarchy, Participation and Opposition, those characteristics include free and fair elections, the right to vote, freedom of expression and association, protection of individual rights and freedoms, independence of the judiciary, the presence of multiple political parties, and alternative sources of information such as freedom of the press. Now, by that standard, we seem to fall short of the mark a little bit. But fortunately, there's a difference between theory and practice. So let's take a quick snapshot of the practical scenario that existed and still exists with Guyana's political landscape, starting with free and fair elections. According to the Organization of American States, there's no democracy without legitimate, transparent, free and fair elections. It's the closest we come to self-government. Free and fair elections occur when key stakeholder institutions create conditions for leveling the playing field for the candidates, for parties, and for the electorate. A few necessary components should exist then for elections to be considered free and fair. And these institutional standards should not just occur during an election season, but they should form part of the overall institutional climate of that society. These include voter registration processes, voter access to reliable information, accuracy of the registered list of voters, whether voting is free of fraud, whether ballots are counted accurately, whether or not rules are clear for partying and campaign financing. And then the independence and impartiality of the Elections Commission, so that results are respected when they're reported. Now, since 1966, Guyana has held 11 general elections in 1968, 73, 80, 85, 92, 97, 2001, 2006, 2011, 2015, and 2020. In the 1950s and 60s, the independence era and the early years of self-governance, after British Guyana gained independence in 1966, elections in 1968 were widely considered fraudulent because of manipulations of the electoral process and electoral abuses. Subsequent elections in 1970, 1980, and 85 were also widely described as manipulated. In 1978, Guyana went through a constitutional referendum that had major implications for the country's political trajectory. First, the general elections that were due in October 1978 were postponed until December 1980, and that elections was reportedly marred by widespread allegations of fraud also. And second, the parliament elected in 1973 was converted to a constituent assembly and tasked with drafting a new constitution. The new constitution was adopted through legislative and executive processes in 1980. So really only two of those elections were arguably considered free and fair. And even those came into question after consultation with some local sources in academia, the media, security and law enforcement sources here in Guyana. The 1992 and 1997 elections, we learned that no election since 1953 has been free and fair or free of fear. But between 1992 and 2015, there were 5 general elections. The literature shows some consistent improvements in the conduct of those elections compared to earlier decades after independence. But almost none of Guyana's elections is without a list of fraud allegations, whether brought by the main opposition party or international observers. Some of the main tactics identified include control of the Elections Commission and the electoral machinery, manipulation of voters' lists, proxy voting abuses, tampering with ballot boxes, and intimidation and exclusion of opposition party polling place agents. And with the 2020 election so recent in the rear view, there's no need for grand reminders about the fiasco that led to the current incumbent. Interestingly, the United States State Department in its 2020 country reports on human rights practices in Guyana is reporting that international and local observer groups considered those elections to be free and fair. And it was the incumbent government at the time that consisted the results, which led to various rounds of litigation and a month-long recount. But let's not forget the hand of former US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in all that, not to mention his recent return to Guyana as a private citizen and all the fanfare accorded him. As for the 2025 general and regional elections, this cycle is shaping up to be a reliving of history apparently, because when afforded the opportunity to mitigate some of the concerns related to Guyana's long-standing history of rigged elections, the Guyana Elections Commission, GCOM, reported that Guyana is not ready for this type of modernization, citing a litany of legal, technical, and resource constraints why the country is unable to upgrade to biometric voting. And apparently, no polling place cameras will be installed either, as called for by the Alliance for Change, the AFC. So, how is the mathsing this election season? Population growth. In January 2020, Guyana's population was estimated at about 807,000 approximately, according to World Bank estimates. More recent estimates update the 2025 population to be about 836,000. That's an increase of roughly 27,000, 28,000 people and a 3.5% increase over the 5-year period. The revised list of electors, the voters list. Recently, GCOM reported that the voters list increased from about 661,000 in 2020 to some 738,000 in 25. That's an increase of 77,100 people or so, and approximately 12% increase over the 5-year period. The current list, though, suggests that 89 to 98% of Guyana's total population is registered to vote. Now, that's a statistical inaccuracy because other sources estimate that 30 to 40% of Guyana's population is under the legal voting age, 18. Some GCOM commissioners even estimate the list to be exceeding the resident voting age population in Guyana by some 126,000 names. In other words, the list is inflated. Serious anomalies exist, like mass registration at a single address, and these reinforce suspicions of electoral manipulation. Immigration. Tens of thousands of Venezuelan immigrants and immigrants from other parts of the region are now in Guyana, formally registered since 2020. The government and United Nations sources put that estimate to be about 30 to 40,000, and if we include indirect ancestry, that number is inflated to about 100,000 people. Available demographic estimates suggest that over 80% of Venezuelan migrants are between age 15 and 49 years old. In other words, most migrants are adults, likely over the voting age. According to United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, between port entry and other field outreach efforts, some 24,000 Venezuelan migrants were officially registered in Guyana between October 2018 and November 2024. So some migrants may be legally eligible to vote, but murky documentation procedures and differing estimates on the aggregates make the issue politically sensitive in what is perceived to be an already tight political race. So to sum it up, In a quote by Human Rights Watch in its summary of conclusions on the electoral conditions in Guyana, recently reported that since independence, massive systemic electoral fraud has denied Guyanese the right to freely elect government. Free and fair elections cannot be held without fundamental changes to the deeply flawed electoral machinery, which is ideally suited for manipulation by the governing party, an opportunity for fraud which the government has repeatedly seized. End of quote. So what are your thoughts about the likelihood of Guyana's 2025 general and regional elections being conducted fairly and free of fraud and manipulation? Join me and the rest of the community to share your knowledge, your experience, your concerns, your fears, your insights about the upcoming elections in Guyana. The diaspora community has a strong interest in who assumes leadership, government of the country over the next 5 years. And as with other important diaspora developments, Guyana Tapestry is committed to bringing fact-based, balanced perspective that helps the global community not only connect to the issues, but crystallize areas of importance and relevance to the community. Family, this is Guyana Tapestry. I am Pelham Van Kooten, and I'm telling Guyana's immigration story.